What defines career success? What makes a person into a star candidate? And what's all the noise around fit? If you're an employer seeking outstanding talent, or if you're a person seeking new opportunities, you can't miss today's Toronto Speaks Career, Talent, and Leadership. Welcome to Toronto Speaks Careers, Talent and Leadership. I'm Richard Ways, President and CEO of TWC International Executive Search, and your host. Tonight we'll be exploring the truths and myths about career advancement, and we'll also examine what leading employers are looking for in terms of key talent. We'll be hearing perspectives from a well-known Toronto-based CEO who's had a remarkable career story. We'll also learn from an expert in talent assessment with over 20 years of experience in the field. I'm delighted to have these outstanding individuals with us today. Louis Rose is the CEO of Bakerstone International. With experience in both private and publicly held companies across a variety of sectors, including food manufacturing, distribution, technology, consumer packaged goods, and media and entertainment. Louis is currently CEO of Bakerstone International, a developer and marketer of pizza ovens and cooking accessories to retailers in 17 countries. He's got quite an inspirational story to tell us about his own career advancement, learnings along the way, and what he now does in order to bring great people to his organizations. Guy Baudin is senior partner at RHR International, a long-established firm of organizational psychologists specializing in the assessment and development of senior executives and teams, including CEO succession. Guy is a renowned expert in people assessment and has helped companies big and small to identify their leaders and the gaps in their management teams. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here tonight. It's quite a thrill.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start with Louis. So Louis, your career has been, as I said before, quite remarkable. You've done some amazing things, and your career progression is, I think, what people will find a little surprising, because you came from far away to this country, and you've been a success so many times in a number of steps. But I'm sure you've had all kinds of learnings along the way, and I think that's what we're hoping that you'll share with us today. What is it that you've learned as you've moved forward in your career? We'd love to hear more.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that I'm a proud Canadian by choice and not by birth. And that's provided me with an opportunity to look at the world through multicolored lenses. From my point of view, some of the key learnings and attributes that I've found: adaptability, the ability to deal with different circumstances with calmness and thoughtfulness, breadth of experience, which has given me the opportunity to involve myself in businesses and in careers that are of different natures and sizes. And most importantly, the ability to get on with people, the ability to lead, to motivate, and to develop relationships along the way. And then, of course, the focused ability to get the job done.
What are some of the great accomplishments you've had in your career? I mean, I wanted to go actually a little bit through your career history to talk about some of the things you've done, because I think it makes it obviously that much more real for the viewer to understand what have you done, what's taken you from place to place, what experiences have you had. And one of the things that I really find very admirable about your career is that you've reinvented yourself quite a few times, actually. And it's not, a lot of people think about themselves and, I'm going to stay in this role for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. You've not necessarily done that. Myself, I've also had to reinvent myself a couple of times. So I'd love to hear more.
Sure. Well, my professional background is as a CA, which is a very good springboard for a multitude of careers. I ended up, after doing my CA, literally left the profession the day I qualified, because it wasn't something I wanted to do long term, but provided a very good foundation. Joined Wood Gundy, which at the time was one of the preeminent investment banks in Canada. Started off in the operations treasury management area, moved into the corporate finance area, which in turn led to an opportunity at Maple Leaf Mills at the time. I was 27 years old. It was a $750 million business. And when the CEO of the acquirer asked if I would join, I think I answered the question before they finished asking me. And it was a fantastic opportunity when, at the time, decentralized management was not a philosophy that was practiced in Canada or North America. And it had been owned in a very, and managed in a very bureaucratic, hierarchical way. And so we breathed entrepreneurial fresh air into the organization. One of the biggest challenges was the transaction closed on August the 25th, 1987. The stock market crashed 23% in a day just 2 months later. No one gives you a manual that says on page 72, this is what you do when the market crashes by 23%. So you learn to deal with changing circumstances using judgment and common sense.
That's great. Well, Guy, I'm curious to know, have you seen people like this, and what do you think about reinvention of oneself in the course of a career, and what kind of people are successful at doing that, perhaps?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's interesting because the two of you have done it, but I haven't. I mean, I really kind of figured out.
There's still time.
I know, but I figured out the one thing that I could do well, and I decided to stick with it. But I think the reinvention, I think, is very, very difficult. And it requires some of the things that you have talked about, actually. It's very interesting because you talked about adaptability, you talked about being even-keeled and ability to get along with people. I think those are kind of foundational elements. I think that will kind of carry you through kind of across a variety of careers. But I actually think for most people, I think that's the challenging thing to do. I think so. How does one go about doing that? I think first of all, you really need to know yourself very well. What is my core skill set, and how can I apply it to a variety of different areas? So you had kind of some interpersonal skills that you've described, and I know you a little bit, so I could vouch for those. But also you had a good foundation in terms of being a CA, and that can carry you through kind of across a variety of different sectors. So I think you kind of need a basic skill that you can adapt to different environments. But I think for me, those kind of personal characteristics, interpersonal ones, are probably even more important in terms of one's ability to reinvent oneself.
And to be successful in the adaptability, you have to find a position or a role that has the needs that match your experience and skill set. So if you want to put yourself into a situation to be the best position to succeed, you want to have a role that you have the skills and the aptitude to do well in.
We haven't really dug into it, and we'll talk beyond your career, obviously, but I just find it remarkable. I mean, I know personally among your accomplishments were moving, from that senior financial role at Maple Leaf, and then you moved into Alliance Atlantis and as a president, and that's completely different industry. Talking about going from a food business into the media entertainment business. I'm very curious. Where was the insight? And I think it's a great message for the general public to hear that employers would actually be open to bringing in someone with a very, very different skill set. And I'm wondering, even as an employer yourself, have you actually become someone who's welcomed someone who doesn't necessarily come with the exact skill set or the exact experience, but does have the transferable skill set? And the other great, fascinating move is how you moved into a publicly traded gaming business, which again is a whole other world. It's amazing that you were able to adapt that way, and I just want to hear more about it.
Right. So Maple Leaf at the time had revenues of about $3 billion. So you may say, why do you go from revenues of $3 billion to a television production company called Atlantis at the time, which had $100 million in revenue? But frankly, if you looked at the landscape in Canada, there wasn't the capacity to have two companies, Alliance and Atlantis, grow to the scale that you'd expect. So inevitably, looking forward, there was going to be some consolidation in Canada. So that, to me, was the opportunity. In terms of the skill set that was required, Atlantis had gone public and had grown very rapidly and was looking for ability to develop a strategic plan and long-term thinking, credibility in the investment community, and the requirement to take the company and elevate it to a level that could accommodate a merger of Alliance and Atlantis. And those were predominantly the three skill sets that I brought to the circumstance that had very little to do with the size of the company, but more to do with the opportunity in the circumstance.
Can I jump in? There's something really interesting about that, I think, because It requires a couple of things. As you said, you knew your core skill set and where you could apply it. But also, there's a kind of component of humility. And I think an ability to reinvent oneself, you kind of need to have a dose of humility. So you went from a larger company to a smaller company to kind of, because you knew you could add value there and make a difference. A lot of people won't do that. Or if you are going to reinvent yourself, you probably need to take a couple of steps back from a career perspective. And again, kind of ego gets in the way, and people, if you've been a vice president, you probably need to go back, to a director or a senior manager or something to kind of learn the basics of the business in order to kind of go back up again. But a lot of people are reluctant to do that, which I think is probably one of the major barriers where a lot of people don't reinvent themselves, because it does take a dose of humility to kind of go back and learn from the ground up.
Just building upon that point, Guy, one of the things we've talked about in the past are things like self-awareness, and the humility piece comes into that, obviously. So what do you think, the employers want to see in their best talent, let's say? Where does this come in, this piece that you're talking about?
So, this could be we could talk all week about this
Sure.
topic because it's a really interesting one. But if I had to summarize it, I think what employers want is high talent and low maintenance, right? So they want someone who can deliver, get the job done, and you described that kind of in some elements of your career, Louis. But also they want someone who's low maintenance. So we talked about adaptability. You talked about low ego. I had a conversation with one of my CEO clients this week who said, running this business is really hard. Why do people come to me with, they can't get along with one of their, coworkers, or they kind of come to me with problems as opposed to coming to me with solutions. So I think there's a component around this sort of high talent, low maintenance piece, which is really, when you boil it down, what employers are looking for. This self-awareness is more complicated, right? So how do you really get to know what you're good at, and how do you know where you get in your own way, which is, I think, one of the kind of core things, to know where you can, what are your derailers and some of the things that kind of stop you from moving forward. And I think that experience is a good teacher that way. But I think you really need to get the feedback from your employer and even from the people around you. Sometimes spouses, family can reflect to you kind of part of your personality that you will take to the workplace. I think that's another way to kind of increase that self-awareness.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. And in fact, what can we do? It's a tough thing because a lot of us don't want to hear what our faults are. Some of us are reluctant to pick up on it. And in what I do, and I think especially in what you do, we're often running into people who are definitely not self-aware. They haven't been told, some of their little quirks and things like that they really have to manage somehow, not to leave the wrong impression or just boastfulness even, or any things like that. What have you seen that has been in this vein challenging for people to figure out?
I would say two things about that. One is most organizations are terrible at giving people honest and direct feedback, and we can complain about that, but the fact of the matter is it's your career. And if you want to know what you're good at and you want to know how people perceive you, go out and get that information.
But even that is being self-aware. You have to be. I guess it's about, think about yourself from time to time and figure out, well, what am I all about, and really, and go through that exercise. And a lot of people won't do that.
That's a very good point. It's the second thing I was going to say. Also, you have to approach it with a desire to learn. And sometimes you are going to get feedback, again, from friends and family, but our tendency sometimes is to be defensive and try to prove them wrong, as opposed to approaching it as well, that's interesting, I don't see myself that way. Can you tell me what am I doing that's causing that impression on you? And then you can learn in terms of between your intentions and your perceptions. Sometimes, there's a really big gap, and the only way to do that is by having those kinds of very honest conversations.
So, Louis, did you ever do that?
Sure. So if you look at being successful as a candidate or being successful as an employer, being successful as an employer, let's just talk about that for a second first, because Warren Buffett talks about the trifecta of what he looks for in successful candidates. There's energy, there's intelligence, and there's integrity. And he says two without the third isn't sufficient criteria for success. But I actually think there's a fourth one. And the fourth one, which is the secret sauce, I think it's the holy grail, it's called judgment. Because if you have an employee that has good judgment, you can delegate, you can feel good when you go to sleep at night that the area of responsibility that employee has will be well taken care of. The world is becoming increasingly complex, it's becoming increasingly global, and technology is becoming increasingly part of our day-to-day life. It's impossible for you to train an employee so that he or she can anticipate every circumstance. Judgment becomes critical. That's from an employer point of view. So from an employee point of view, when you think about judgment, you have to be, to your point about self-awareness, you have to be honest with yourself. To what extent can you articulate your strengths and your areas where you actually need some development? So develop a strategic plan for yourself. You said take control of your own career. Develop a strategic plan. Articulate to yourself clearly your areas of strength and your areas that need development. Seek input from others and then play to your strengths. So put yourself in a circumstance or in a situation where you will succeed in the role because, to the point that we described earlier, your skill set and experience matches the needs of the role or the position.
And have you done that?
Absolutely. If you look at, well, I just described the Alliance Atlantis circumstance. The need there was a threefold need. In the case of Cryptologic, was founded by incredibly successful entrepreneurial brothers based in Toronto, and the company had grown rapidly and again needed to continue on its growth in a more structured and professional environment. That required public participation on the NASDAQ. We did an IPO in the UK, and of course we were public in Canada. The skill sets that are required for public interaction are different than private or different than entrepreneurial. The second thing was to develop strategic planning to make sure that you have the quality of senior executives in the right place, focused in the right way. So those are some of the things that were required at Cryptologic.
Well, maybe that leads into actually the hiring discussion. So, you talked about putting the right people in the right jobs. I know you both have lots of expertise in doing that in terms of you actually hiring those people and you assessing the teams to ensure that the fits are there and all that. And we can talk about fit at the same time because that's obviously an enormous issue. And yes, everybody talks about fit and all that, but what does fit mean for you? And how do you hire the right people who fit into your organization? So
the irony is that people generally hire based on competence and fire based on fit, and this is a conversation that we've had before, whereas logically you ought to do the reverse. Spend the time making sure that the cultural fit is there, and that requires the values that ought to be aligned between the individual and the company. So fit does become a critical part of the likelihood of success in an organization.
And I think, it's because that's what we get hired for. We get hired to assess the fit between an individual and the role and the culture of the organization. And usually by that point, they have the right skills or experience and they've met kind of that threshold. But the fit for me, I think it comes back to, maybe I'll use sort of that framework, kind of low maintenance. How is this person going to show up every day? What does that person look like under stress? What is it going to be like to work with that individual? How do we best manage them? What are they like as a leader? I mean, those are behavioral things, how someone shows up every day. I think that's what really people talk about when they talk about fit. And I agree completely with Lewis that I think there's an overemphasis on just kind of the resume skills because, those are they're an important factor, but by no means the most important ones, I think, in terms of what makes somebody successful. Right. And I would say one more thing to that. I think in terms of how employers assess fit, I think they generally do a poor job because they're not specific enough in terms of what are the key characteristics that are going to be required for success in the role. So they come either with a job description or they come with a long list of competencies, but generally in a job, and you've described it a couple of times yourself, like 3 or 4 things that each job needs to really kind of to ring that bell. And if employers did a better job of identifying those 3 or 4 areas, then I think they do a much better job in terms of their hiring.
But once they've identified those, the next step then is to execute. And how do you execute effectively? So Charlie Munger, who's the 90-plus-year-old partner of Warren Buffett, says that hardly a day goes by when he continues to remind himself how he underestimates the correlation between human behavior and compensation. So to have the 3 or 4 key elements are essential, but then to have a plan to ensure the appropriate implementation of those would mean that you have to spend the time on compensation, incentive plans that directly drive behavior to the required outcome.
I was talking to a CEO this week, ex-CEO who managed one of our large financial institutions very successfully for a long period of time, and he said, my job was psychologist in chief. That essentially his role was about finding the right talent, aligning the rewards to their behaviors that are required, and making sure that people are in the right kind of mindset, resilience to actually get the job done. And I think that's, again, what you want to look for in terms of your key talent.
Right. I think, the one thing I'm always telling employers is it's very nice to have a beautiful resume and, the person's got a beautiful career history and progression, no real red flags on paper, but that still doesn't mean that just because they were successful somewhere else, they're going to be successful in your organization. And I've seen it many times where mistakes are made because they brought in someone just because they were so impressed with what they saw on paper, but, possibly in an interview. It comes back to, I think you guys were getting into this a little bit, the point about preparing and doing your work in advance before you actually start considering talent, determining what kind of culture, what kind of organization have we created here? Have we built a place that is an employer of choice? Are people going to want to work here? Well, how do you do that? How do you create a place that is going to be attractive to the talent market? Because good people, good talent have choices. They can go to a few places. So what makes your place better? Louis, I know you've had to go through that, and I'd love to know as well, Guy, what have you seen as examples of companies where they've actually created that culture before even approaching the talent market, that is so enviable rather, for the corporate community?
So let me talk about my daughter for a second. She's got her first full-time job, and she absolutely loves it. And what is it about her job that has motivated her? First of all, she feels and believes that what she does really matters. Secondly, they've developed a personalized career training development program for her. Thirdly, they listen to feedback. Fourthly, it's legitimate. In other words, it's the tone from the top. If the CEO absolutely believes that the culture he or she is trying to create is important enough to permeate the organization and lives it and breathes it, it will happen. But you can't give passing words and commentary to that effect. You actually have to live it and breathe it. And so what I'm seeing firsthand in the case of my daughter is a culture that has enveloped her, and she absolutely believes, and this is her first full-time job, she absolutely believes.
And she's a millennial.
And she's a millennial, exactly right, that what she does makes a difference.
Right.
Yeah, my perspective on that would be, first of all, there's like lots of theories of motivation that you've just described there in 3 minutes. It's very interesting. Our work matters, and I matter. I think if I get philosophical for a second, I think that in a society where certain structures like family and church and community kind of have fallen down, I think people want a place where they belong. I do something that's important, and I really matter to this organization. And how do you achieve that? It's really through good leadership. I think, to me, good culture, it's always about having people who treat other individuals with the kind of respect that they deserve, who provide them the opportunities and a chance to stretch themselves, and who actually bring sort of these very kind of humanistic values into the workplace. I think we can't dissociate, kind of ourselves in our personal lives and our work lives. I think we all are looking for the same things in those environments.
And frankly, a good dose of fun from time to time.
Yeah.
Now, we're not saying that business isn't serious. Business can be serious, but it's not always solving life and death situations. And there's always a time and a place for camaraderie outside of the rigorous nature of
What do you do, I think it'd be interesting to hear what you did for fun in terms of making the workplace that kind of place for, that people would enjoy being.
So in terms of flagship events, we would do annual barbecues and picnics. We went to Center Island, this is based in Toronto. And for kids, we'd have face painting. And as the kids grew up, different age-appropriate activities all the way up to adults. And it's great for senior executives and management to participate and to be your word, humiliated,
Yeah.
and actually taking humble to the next level to show that everybody has a human aspect to them.
Right. One of the things I think, and comes again, I think it ties into what you both are saying, is the question of integrity, and it's from the employers. If the employer is going to tell someone, well, we're hiring you as a director, but you're going to be a vice president in 2 years, and you're on the path and all that. I mean, they better be honest about that. I can say that where I've seen major disappointments is where people are either promised, or at least there's a lot of hints around the fact that there's going to be real career progression, a lack of a glass ceiling and all that, and yet it doesn't wind up being the way that it was promised, and that can affect and permeate the entire corporate environment. Have you seen that?
I think all you can promise is a significant developmental experience, and that you will be stretched in this role and in other roles. I think you never know when you hire someone. I mean, the most difficult thing is to assess someone's potential. How much headroom do they have?
Right.
1 level, 2 levels, and I think until you've actually spent some time with someone, you really can't predict those things. So I think it is a lack of integrity to make those promises up front.
But that goes to the heart of cultural alignment, because if you overpromise to employees, it means it's an indication of the culture of the organization. Because you don't generally overpromise to a single employee. It would be a core cultural value, which is overpromising.
Right. Okay.
So it goes to the heart of integrity, and it goes to the heart of the entire establishment's culture.
Just a quick note on integration. What has worked for either of you in terms of bringing on good people, and what have you seen? And in terms of bringing them on and making them succeed in the role, what is it? If you could say it in a couple of sentences, even. Or even shorter, actually. I'm sorry. You know what? I think we're getting pretty close to the end, so I'm sorry. Okay, well, quickly, go ahead. Sorry.
I'd say make sure they have a development plan, make sure they understand the business, and make sure that their expectations are fair and reasonable.
Great. Okay, well, thank you both so much. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have this evening. I really want to thank our outstanding guests, Louis Rose and Guy Baudin, for being here and giving us their excellent insights. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for allowing us into your living rooms, and hopefully we brought you some good food for thought in relation to your career and hiring. I hope that you always have the opportunity in life and in your career to follow your passion, and look forward to seeing you next time on Toronto Speaks Career, Talent, and Leadership. Bye for now.